Philo and the Lighthouse. Living in Egypt in the city of Alexandria in the year 12 BC was a little Jewish boy with the Greek name of Philo who was to become known as the philosopher Philo Judaeus. One morning, Philo, who was then only 9 or 10, woke up with great excitement and much earlier than usual. As he slipped into his sandals and looked out the window, he could tell that it was early because the sun had just tipped the statue of Poseidon that stood on top of the great lighthouse. Pharos, the giant lighthouse in the harbor of Alexandria, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and a sight to be marveled at by neighbors. But it was an old friend to Philo. Every morning he looked upon its tall white tower. Every night with sleepy eyes he watched its light shining in the dark square of his window, while he whispered over once more to himself the verses of the Torah he had to memorize that day. Philo loved the Torah, and he loved the lighthouse, and he was glad that the Torah and the lighthouse and the long, crooked, sandy island on which the lighthouse stood were all connected in a way. He always felt very grateful to Ptolemy Philadelphus, who had built the lighthouse and whose name was so easy to remember because it was like his own. Philo, meaning love, was part of the Philadelphus, which meant one who loves his brother. Philo felt especially grateful to that old Ptolemy on this bright early morning because this was the morning of the festival. That was why he was up so early. He was going to the island for the picnic or festival which the Jewish people of Alexandria held there once a year to celebrate the miracle. And had it not been for Ptolemy Philadelphus, there might never have been a miracle. Even worse, the Torah might never have been translated into Greek. And then, what would have happened to us, he thought, all of us people of Israel here in Alexandria who speak only Greek? How would we ever have been able to learn the law of Moses? At the morning meal, Philo thought he would ask his father about that, and also another question about the miracle. But he soon saw that this was not the morning to bother the practical businessman with questions. Probably his reply would be that he had a miracle of his own to worry about, such as collecting taxes on the east side of the Nile. So Philo went quietly about the table as usual, with a small gold pitcher pouring water on the hands of each member of the family before they ate, according to the law of Moses. Then, eating his meal as fast as possible, he hurried out into the larder, where the last appetizing baskets of food were being packed. There he found 2 new servants, lately come from Jerusalem, who'd never heard of the festival. What was the celebration, they wanted to know? Some wicked festival of the wicked Greeks. If so, they would have nothing to do with it. Philo laughed and shook his head. Then, pleased with such a ready audience, he related to them the story of the miracle. It was a myth that had grown up around the fact that about 250 years ago, there in Alexandria, during the reign of the second Ptolemy, books of the Bible had been translated from the old original Hebrew into Greek. That was the first time in history that any book had ever been translated from one language to another. There was once a ruler of Egypt, Philo began, speaking slowly because the newcomers from Jerusalem spoke Aramaic and still had some trouble understanding Greek. The ruler's name was Ptolemy Philadelphus, he continued, and he was a Greek. He thought it was a shame that his people were not able to read the laws given by Moses to the people of Israel. So he sent to Jerusalem for 70 or 72 elders to come here and translate. This was a very large thing to do because they must not add or take away or change one bit of the word. So Ptolemy had to find them the most quiet place to work. That was the island on which the lighthouse stands, where they would hear nothing but the waves. There the 70 old men took the sacred book and, holding it up towards heaven, prayed that they may not fail. Then each one went off by himself and began to write, and they wrote for 72 days. And when they had finished, it was found that each one had written exactly the same thing, word for word. So that legend was the basis for this festival. It began early, long before mid-morning on the bridge to the island was crowded with people, laughing, singing, shouting, jostling one another. Good-natured Egyptians, light-hearted Greeks joined with the Jews. For Alexandria was a happy meeting place of the East and West, a city where the people and ideas and customs of Asia and Europe met and mingled. Prayers and thanksgiving came first. Then, in tents erected on the beach or seated on the sand, the open-air festival was enjoyed by the circle of relatives and friends. After playing for a while with the other children, Philo went off to sit by himself and think. He loved to think and to try to search out the truth about all sorts of questions. Soon he was really a small philosopher. For that word philosopher, which also contained his name, actually means one who loves wisdom. Anyone who is curious to learn every sort of knowledge and is never satisfied may be called a philosopher, said Plato, who was himself one of the greatest of them all, and that name was Plato, not Plato. Philo was certainly curious to learn. He was thinking this day about the world and the story of how it was created, which he could never quite understand. The world had been created in 6 days, they said, but how long was each of those days? Days were measured by the sun, but the sun itself had not been created until the 4th day. That was what he was puzzled over now, as he sat with his chin in his hand gazing across the harbor towards the city. Edging the opposite shore and reflecting in the crystal clearness of the water were the royal palaces. Almost directly across from him were the museum and the library, full of thousands of books. This was not the library built by Ptolemy Philadelphus. That, he knew, had been even larger. But in the days of Cleopatra, when Philo's father, was a boy, that library had been set on fire accidentally by the soldiers of Julius Caesar. What a terrible thing. All those books burned to ashes before he had a chance to read them. But someday he was going to read all the books in this library. He wanted to read and find out what the old philosophers of Greece had said and thought about the world and how it had been made. Then perhaps he could figure out how long those 6 days were supposed to be and other things that puzzled him. As he grew older, Philo was to read many of those books in the great library of Alexandria, and though he held fast to his own religion and the wisdom of Israel, he was also to understand and appreciate the great wisdom of the Greeks. Surprised at first to find so much that was similar to their ideas, he made the mistake of thinking that they must have learned the truth from reading the Torah and the Psalms and Proverbs and other sacred books of his people. He did not realize that truth is the same wherever it is found, and that some part of it may be found by all who truly search for it. And perhaps, too, he did not realize that the Greek philosophers had lived and taught long before the books of the Bible were translated into Greek. Back in the time they were being written down in ancient Hebrew.